Mary Tamm, Second Generation, The Autobiography, Volume 2. Read by the Timekeys, Romana. Chapter 13. America, Airlines, and Australia. I visited St. Louis twice for 2 respective cons and found the city to be enchanting. The fans were still as fiercely zealous as ever, though, and I even found one sleeping outside my door one morning, which was quite scary. I rang security and the poor guy was removed, but I felt quite shaken. As a result, and at subsequent cons, it became the practice for all guest celebs to adopt assumed names for their stay. I can't remember what they all were, and no, I wouldn't reveal them if I could. Sorry. We were also introduced to a nifty way of avoiding the enthusiastic devotees who mobbed us as we were escorted from one engagement to another. We swiftly traveled along the service corridors in the bowels of the hotel, even passing through the kitchens at some points. Very glamorous. Also in St. Louis, I was taken out to dinner on a huge paddle steamer moored on the Mississippi River, which ran through the city. Steamboats had enabled significant progress in 19th century river trade, as steam power permitted much more efficient and dependable river transportation. I was fascinated to see a relic of those bygone days, but more than a little disappointed to discover that it was owned by McDonald's now, and the cuisine was just like any other of its fast food outlets. The company that joined me there were the organizers of the event, and some fans who had won a prize to have dinner with me. This was becoming a norm on the convention circuit. Usually it was breakfast, for some reason, but I'd progressed to longer meals in the evenings. I had my reservations about this, knowing how some fans could behave, and still perturbed by finding the one outside my hotel room. However, as the proceeds of the prize draw were for charity, I decided it would be churlish to refuse, and besides, how much of an ordeal could it be? The prize winners made no conversation, but merely gawped at me all evening as I downed my Big Mac and fries as elegantly as I possibly could under the circumstances. I was quite uncomfortable, especially as I was expected to keep up a flowing monologue about myself and my work on Doctor Who, so was very glad when the dinner was over and we repaired to a nearby drinking joint where we danced the night away. And my relief to have been freed from the constraints of the fan dinner, I became somewhat inebriated on a scrumptious cocktail introduced to me there for the first time, the margarita. I left the premises in the early hours of the morning, held up by the loyal fans, who assured me the next day that no, I had not misbehaved in any way, but had merely tried to climb into a car with some dubious-looking rednecks, who had invited me to a party. The fans had dragged me away just in time. They fondly assured me that, despite this, I was still number 1 in their hearts. I was mortified, however, and resolved to behave myself in future, which I duly did, for a while anyway. I put my behavior down to stress and jet lag, but stuck to breakfast only with the fans from that time onwards. I was quite taken, in retrospect, with the novel idea of the McD steamer, and thought afterwards how bizarre yet innovative the idea was. In LA, many years later, I visited a similarly unexpected location for the eatery chain, which wasn't a mock palace, only in America. It seemed every place I visited in the States had something of interest to offer. In Springfield, Massachusetts, I visited the Basketball Museum, which was a revelation. I had played netball at school and had enjoyed it immensely, so was very interested to learn the basics of the U.S. version and see displays and info about its greatest players. It's worth a visit, believe me, if you ever get there. In Philadelphia, I visited the Christchurch burial ground, where Benjamin Franklin is interred, and which is a marvelous place to explore colonial and revolutionary history. Back in Chicago again, I chatted with fans of the Chicago Bears, who persuaded me to wear the team's baseball cap and to explain the rudiments of American football to me. I still have an open invitation to go to a game with them. One day I must take them up on it. On my previous visit, as described earlier, I had seen Lake Michigan practically at freezing point. This time, in summer, I sunbathed on its shores and even plunged its waters for a dip. At yet another convention, I was over the moon to meet Stan Lee, the renowned illustrator who presented me with a signed comic of his creation and my personal favorite, the Silver Surfer. Over the 20 years or so of attending WhoCons, it has been a huge privilege for me to visit so many wonderful places and meet lovers of the program. Not only that, but it has given me the opportunity to meet up with friends, old and new, from Who. We are like a vast club of travelers now, reuniting all over the world. In 1993, I was invited to a convention in Sydney, Australia, which was organized by students at the university there. They unexpectedly gave me an allowance for my airfare instead of adopting the usual practice of simply sending me a ticket, hence giving me the freedom to choose my own travel route. The sum I was given meant I could also bring along a guest, something which had not been possible since my first convention in Chicago. Marcus could not get time off work for a week, so I decided to take my daughter, Lauren, who was 13 years old at the time. I looked into booking our flights with British Airways, but after ringing around, discovered that we could fly club class on Garuda, the national airline of Indonesia, for the same price. I opted for this latter choice, but in my eagerness to snap up a bargain, did not take in how long the stopovers in each city on the way to Oz would be, never having had much of an eye or ear for detail. Consequently, the journey there took 2 days. Our seats had plenty of legroom, and the service was fantastic, as a steady stream of exquisitely beautiful stewardesses catered to our every need. On the first leg of the journey, which took about 8 hours, we were also presented with gifts, tiny, decorative, but basically useless little vases, which we assiduously stowed away with our hand luggage. Our first stop was at Abu Dhabi. We had several hours to kill at the airport, which was the most opulent I had ever seen in my life, with bejeweled vault-like ceilings and a myriad of shops selling gold and gem jewelry. It was like a huge Aladdin's cave. Lauren and I wandered around the vast area for ages, trying on necklaces and bracelets and ogling the colorful Arab kaftans that were draped everywhere in the souk-styled stalls. We then repaired to the business class lounge to loll around and snack on the freebies. Back on the plane, we were given more food and more of the miniature vases, which were duly stashed as before. Bali was our next stop, where we languished for half a day. It had been almost 36 hours since we had left London by the time we boarded the plane for Australia. More food, more vases, and finally Sydney. A warm welcome from the students greeted us, although they confessed that they had already been to the airport the day before to await my arrival, only to realize I was still a day away. The length of our journey was literally unbelievable, even to them. On the way to the hotel, we marveled at the vegetation. Towering eucalyptus trees swaying gently overhead, red gum trees, and to our amazement, white cockatoos flying from tree to tree. Even in the town center, they were everywhere. We were staying outside the city in an area called Parramatta. The impoverished students could not afford the opulence of downtown, but we did not mind, as it seemed a pleasant enough suburb, with a convenient mall nearby, which we both quickly spotted on the way there. Lauren had inherited my enthusiasm for shopping. The hotel was of a decent standard, and we retired to our rooms to unpack. I switched the TV on and was immediately gripped by the sight of a huge croc, appropriately enough, which was leaping out of a creek and snapping at a guy who was obviously trying to bond with it. I am hugely fond of the reptile genius, so was fascinated at the man's boldness as he lured the massive beast with words of encouragement, all the while reprimanding him each time the flashing gnashes drew too close for comfort, with a mild, naughty boy, naughty boy. I was enchanted. This was a guy after my own heart. Who was he? Of course, as I learned later, it was none other than the late, great Steve Irwin, iconic Australian television personality, wildlife expert and conservationist. He was unknown in England at this time, but later achieved worldwide fame from the television series The Crocodile Hunter. Mark Strickson, aka Turlo from Doctor who was also a guest at the con, had immigrated to Australia, where he subsequently studied zoology and then became a documentary producer and director, especially of wildlife programs. It was he who brought Steve to public attention in Europe with such shows as The 10 Deadliest Snakes in the World. I had, of course, previously met Mark in Chicago at the Spirit of Light Con, and it was wonderful to see him here, in his own natural habitat, as it were, and learn of his new life and his work with Steve. Fascinating. We lay down on the beds for a quick nap before supper. Lowell soon dropped off, but I found drifting off to sleep impossible. I had not previously experienced jet lag too badly, but the journey had been so long and we had passed through so many time zones on the way that my internal clock no longer knew whether it was day or night. I was exhausted, but wide awake. At 8 local time, we duly repaired to the next door restaurant, Chinese, excellent, to meet up with our hosts, and had a delightful evening chatting to the students who had organized the convention and learned more of the schedule for the coming week. We arranged to meet up for lunch the following day and went off to bed. Again, Lowell dropped off at once, but I literally tossed and turned all night, day long. The morning arrived several long, lonely hours later, and we headed off to the mall, where Lauren begged me to let her have her ears pierced. This entreaty had been repeated many times back in London, and I'd always refused. Now, however, being so tired that I was practically seeing double, I gave in and sat with her while the procedure was performed. We shopped and returned to the hotel. Lunch was in the eatery there, and I ordered soup, which was all I could imagine eating. I was so like a walking zombie by now. Our hosts were chatting and laughing. It seemed to me like a distant tinkling in the distance. Next thing I knew, I was coughing and spluttering and felt a burning on my face and neck. What the hell had happened? The faces around me were concerned, but hang on. What were those expressions they were trying so hard to conceal? Not amusement, surely? Yes, indeed, it was. I had literally fallen dead asleep, face first, into my hot soup, and was now covered in an assortment of tiny pasta shapes and vegetables which were hanging off my hair, nose, and clothes. No wonder the company seemed tickled. I must have looked a sight. We all burst into laughter. I excused myself and staggered groggily back to my room to shower and change. It was just as well none of the fans had arrived yet. I must have appeared like a drunken sot. The lunch was mercifully brief, and Lowell and I ascended to our room once more to discover an enormous bouquet of magnificent tropical blooms lying on the table there. A heady aroma filled the air, and we both leaned in to take in the scent, with Lauren wondering who they were from. The convention organizers, darling, I explained, or one of the fans, maybe. You see, when I travel round the world, I announced grandly, I get all sorts of gifts and messages sent to me. I was ripping open the card attached to the flowers by now. One does get used to it after a time. I am always terribly grateful, of course, but... My voice tailed off as the card revealed Lauren's name with the message, from an unknown admirer. The girl was only 13, and already she was receiving floral tributes. I did not know whether to feel proud or peeved. I chose the former, and looked on with fond maternal love as Lowell blushingly read the card for herself and gently laid the flowers in water. It was a huge confidence booster for her, and a lesson for me. Never take your public for granted, missus. Later that day, I was introduced to the wonderful Katie Manning, who was also now living in Australia. I had never met her before, so it was a real pleasure to make her acquaintance and get to know her better over the ensuing week, when she also attended the con. She had popped in to say hello, and when she heard of my terrible jet lag, she fished into her bag and produced a sleeping tablet, which I took that night. I slept for the first time in about 3 days, and woke up as refreshed as a crock in the rainy season. 3 cheers for Katie. We still had a couple days before the convention started, so headed off to visit Marcus's cousin Lottie, who lived in Manly, a beautiful seaside suburb. Her house was superb, built into the rocks of Sydney Harbour, and with steps leading down to a private beach. The standard of living was very high on that continent, a fact I had heard from other various Australian nannies, and now witnessed firsthand. Lottie was a government minister working for women's rights. She also ran a restaurant at weekends, as well as looking after 4 children. In other words, she was a superwoman. I chatted away to her while Lauren played with the kids and found her to be charming and intelligent. She told me that Dirk, Bogard rented her house in the summer, as it reminded him so much of the south of France, where he was domiciled. I was not surprised. It was like a fairy tale castle, and somewhat reminiscent of the building in Modesty Blaise, in which Bogard had starred. After a delicious supper, we whizzed back to our hotel in a huge hovercraft, crossing the vast reaches of the Sydney harbour on the way and passing the amazing opera house, often seen in photos and even more impressive in life. We viewed it at close quarters the next day, strolling up and down the huge swath of stairs before heading off to the zoo, where we stroked Ruse and cuddled a cute koala. After a glimpse of Bondi Beach, fabulous even in the wintry cold, I was ready to greet the fans at the convention. My jet lag had practically disappeared now, thanks to Katie and her magic pill, so I was revved up and raring to go. The convention was small by US standards and consequently relatively stress-free and enjoyable, with lots of time to chat to the Aussie fans who were all very enthusiastic and well-behaved. I was seated on a table next to Katie for signings, and marveled at her flamboyant signature, which took about 5 times longer than mine to execute, especially with the extra flourish or two Katie added in the shape of a heart or kisses. I resolved to do something different with mine then and there, but could only think of adding a line and a kiss underneath. Better than nothing, I suppose. I still sign my autograph in this way, even now. Lauren spent a day with an old friend of mine, Lynn Dalby, whose daughter Amy was the same age. Her dad and my old pal, actor Ray Lonan, had been married to Lynn, and Marcus and I had been frequent guests at their home when they had been together in London. Now she was back in her native land, and it was great to see her, albeit briefly, as we had not clapped eyes on each other for years. We finished the convention with an auction of personal items donated by the celebs, with proceeds going to charity, and then all too soon our trip to Oz was over. I decided that a week here was really much too short, and resolved to travel back some day to see it all again in a more leisurely fashion, with more time for family and friends too. I phoned Marcus at the airport to tell him we were on the way back. "What?" he roared, "but it's only Monday!" Of course, he had not really grasped the torturous length of the incredible journey ahead of us either. Flying back over the vast continent of Australia was a revelation. 4 hours of interminable dun-coloured, empty flatlands stretched below us, a strange and almost alien landscape. I thought back to Ken Hannum and his tales of the outback, which he had related during the filming of the Assassination Run. Anything could happen down there, and no one would be any of the wiser. We touched down at Heathrow, me jet-lagged and Lauren as bright as a button. Must have been all the travelling she did while still in utero, to be greeted by Marcus, who whisked us back home. I unpacked our stuff and set aside the final tally of 24 little gift vases from Garuda Indonesia Airlines. Try as I could, they never quite looked right, wherever or however I displayed them. I gave them to a charity shop in the end, but for a long time they served as an exotic reminder of a very happy time down under.